It's hard to believe by looking at the aerial shot in 2020 that this was once a thriving amusement park. I'm sorry, I don't mean to undersell it. It was once the world's largest theme park. This would be the last new coaster added to this park, and 3 years later, Six Flags would sell their mega park to none other than Cedar Point's parent company, Cedar Fair. How could this have happened? For starters, Cedar Fair's ownership of Geauga Lake was problematic and could be the subject of a whole other video. And fans of the park were very suspicious of how Cedar Fair was treating it, given its proximity to their flagship park of Cedar Fair's ownership of Geauga Lake was problematic, and it wasn't Cedar Fair's finest moment. In my last mini-doc, I took a look at the fascinating history of Geauga Lake and hyper-focused on Six Flags' role on its rise and fall. And I explained why I thought Six Flags was responsible for the closure of the park. But Six Flags didn't actually close the park. That honor went to Cedar Fair. And they have been roasted over the years as the company who actually pulled the plug on this park that survived well over a century. Why did they buy this damaged park? And why did they close it so soon after? What were their motives? Today, let's dig up Geauga Lake once again for further examination and put Cedar Fair on the hot seat. Let's start off with a simple question. Why did Cedar Fair buy the park? Attendance had been slipping every year since 2001, but was holding steady at a respectable number, 2.7 million to 2.15 million to 2 million by the time the sale went down before the 2004 season. We all know that the park only drew in 700,000 guests in its first year as a Cedar Fair park. And it's not clear if they expected that big of a drop-off. But the better question is, did they care? One of the top accusations aimed at Cedar Fair is that they bought the park just to shut it down. Their flagship park of Cedar Point was just 90 minutes west, and Six Flags tried to use this park to draw people away from Cedar Point once they expanded it into the mega park, Worlds of Adventure. It's very possible that they saw the chance to eliminate a potential competitor and they took it. If someone like Anheuser-Busch reacquired the park and did a good job operating it, it could have taken away from Cedar Point's clientele. Nobody on the Cedar Fair side would ever admit if this was the case, but it's entirely possible that they saw the sale going two ways. The park becomes profitable and they have another successful park in their portfolio. Or the park flops and they get rid of a source of competition and they have a lot of assets that they can disperse into their other parks. The price they paid is also the subject of debate. Was it a steal or did they get taken to the cleaners? Let's take a look at the number, $145 million. This included the park itself, along with the coasters, as well as the hotel and the campgrounds. Compare this to the price that Six Flags paid just for SeaWorld Ohio 3 years prior, $110 million. Just $35 million less than Cedar Fair paid for everything combined. Also consider what Cedar Fair paid for the Paramount Parks package just 2 years later, $1.24 billion. This included 5 major parks, plus Gilroy Gardens. This amounts to well over $200 million per park. Granted, these were in much better shape than Geauga Lake at the time, but it shows that they got a favorable price and felt that no matter what happened from that point on, they could spin it in a favorable light for the company. The first obvious thing that Cedar Fair did was to strip out all of the Six Flags theming, including all of the Looney Tunes and DC characters that they did not own the rights to. But the first noteworthy thing they did was to completely shut down and raise the marine life side of the park. This was an obvious move, since they didn't have any experience or desire to deal with all of the work that goes along with taking care of animals and putting on animal shows. Six Flags took their animals out of the park after the sale, so Cedar Fair would have had to seek out their own. This was a big commitment, and since Cedar Fair was looking to scale back this mega park anyway, it was an easy choice for the first casualty. It was clear that Cedar Fair wanted to bring back the family appeal to Geauga Lake, which is why their first main investment into the property was to turn the old SeaWorld land into a new $26 million water park, Wild Water Kingdom. This would open in 2005. Making Geauga Lake the family-friendly destination to contrast the monster thrill park of Cedar Point was a good idea. But those families that they wanted to attract really enjoyed the marine life section of the park, and now that was gone. That was what really made this park stand out from the other Ohio parks, Cedar Point and Paramount's Kings Island. This helps explain why attendance dropped 65% from 2003 to 2004, with no marine life section, but before Wildwater Kingdom opened. Cedar Fair CEO Dick Kinzel mentioned that removing the animals from the park caused more damage than expected. There has been a lot of criticism over Cedar Fair's lack of additions into the park over their 4 seasons of operation. The Cedar Fair executives watched Six Flags flood this park with massive new coasters and wind up with declining attendance, so it didn't make a lot of sense to replicate their failed model. All of Cedar Fair's investments would be to the new water park. They did have the existing Hurricane Harbor Park that they inherited and renamed Hurricane Hannah's Water Park, but all of their focus was on their new Wildwater Kingdom, and they would shut down Hurricane Hannah's in 2006. Growing their water park presence was seen as the best way to get families back into the park, as well as draw the locals back in. People don't generally travel great distances to get to a water park, so this was seen as a good way to separate Cedar Point and Geauga Lake's audience. Whatever Cedar Fair had planned for this park back in 2004, the acquisition of the Paramount Parks in 2006 shook up the entire company. As I mentioned before, this would set them back $1.24 billion and nearly double their collection of parks. This would also mean that Cedar Fair owned all 3 major parks in Ohio, which may have led the company to see Geauga Lake as more expendable. The deal also put them in a good deal of debt, which meant that they would be less patient with an underperforming park. Dick Kinzel reportedly stated back in 2005 that the park did not bring in enough revenue to sustain its size, so he started cutting down the park even more. I mentioned the closure of Hurricane Hannah's in 2006, and that was joined with the removal of X-Flight and Steel Venom the same year, with X-Flight immediately headed downstate to Kings Island to open as Firehawk in time for the 2007 season, and Steel Venom being shipped east to Dorney Park to open as Voodoo for the 2008 season. The removal of these 2 coasters let the locals know that the future of this park was not all that bright, and it may be time to pay their last respects. Following all of these ominous indicators, the global economy started showing signs of collapse as early as February of 2007, when Alan Greenspan predicted a recession. So between having to manage 5 new major parks, their newfound debt, and a looming recession, Cedar Fair saw their chance to cut their losses with Geauga Lake and distribute the remaining assets to other parks. But the way they closed the park leads me to believe that their decision may have not been so premeditated. The final day of the 2007 season was September 16th, and 5 days later, Cedar Fair announced that the park would permanently close. Cedar Fair can be a little hit or miss when it comes to giving their attractions a proper send-off, but to not even allow Geauga Lake's loyal fans to say goodbye to this 108-year-old park is hard to wrap my head around. When people tell the story of Geauga Lake, this really paints Cedar Fair in a bad light. After that plunge in attendance from 2003 to 2004, by all accounts, it seemed like it held steady over the final few years, hanging around the 700,000 to 800,000 range. This isn't too bad for a small regional park, but Cedar Fair spokesman Tony Clark said that the company has been disappointed with Geauga Lake's attendance since they acquired the park. The closure would also allow more inexpensive additions to be dispersed throughout the Cedar Fair chain, including granting 2 of their new parks their first new coasters under their new management. The B&M Floorless Dominator went to King's Dominion in 2008, and the Vekoma Boomerang went to Carowinds as Carolina Cobra in 2009. They also shipped their Vekoma SLC, Thunderhawk, to Michigan's Adventure in 2008, their last new coaster addition to that park. Wildwater Kingdom remained popular, and since it was brand new and was the exclusive recipient of Cedar Fair's Geauga Lake investments, it stayed open as the only source of revenue remaining. Cedar Fair tried to sell the land that the amusement park sat on, but has been unsuccessful, even when trying to sell it in parcels. They were advised that they would have an easier time selling the land if they sold the entire property as a whole, including the land that Wildwater Kingdom sat on. So they closed down the park following the 2016 season. As of 2020, the land is still abandoned and owned by Cedar Fair. So based on the facts, what can we conclude about Cedar Fair's motives? Did they acquire this park just to shut down a competitor to Cedar Point? I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that they did not want a competent company buying the property. By 2004, it seems like it was clear that the Worlds of Adventure Megapark was not a sustainable threat to Cedar Point. But it's possible that if Anheuser-Busch acquired the whole thing, like they wanted to before Six Flags bought them out, they could have had a strong, successful business model. I also think the price was right. $145 million was not a lot for this property and all its assets. I don't think they bought it just to close it. I just think that their attitude was indifferent about the park's future. If their mission to turn this back into a family park succeeds and it becomes profitable, then great. If it doesn't, oh well. At least they knocked out some competition, they can relocate the rides, and they can sell the land and try to break even. I still believe that Six Flags set the park up for failure by expanding way too fast and without investing in the staff and the maintenance needed for that expansion, driving away the local family-oriented clientele and making the park into more than it could be. But this was not Cedar Fair's finest moment. Geauga Lake meant a lot to the people in the area, and they took a very cold and corporate approach to it. And this was all capped off by announcing its permanent closure 5 days after the final day of the 2007 season. Let me know what you think about Cedar Fair's role in the closure of Geauga Lake. Do you put the blame on them more so than Six Flags? Or do you think that they inherited a sinking ship and there wasn't much that they could do to save it? Also, what do you think was their motive when they placed that winning bid of $145 million? Geauga Lake is a fascinating case with lots of different angles, so sound off in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave it a like. That's the best way to show your support for the channel. And if you're new here and you're not subscribed yet, please consider doing so and hitting that bell for more theme park content. I also want to thank Extreme Coasters Network for all of the great footage of Geauga Lake in its final season. It's so valuable to have this with the park being gone for 13 years running, and they were generous enough to let me use it for these videos. So be sure to give their channel some love too. You can find their link down below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.